I didn't start off building this wall to explain the history of institutional racism in America. That's just how it ended up. As I studied the laws starting in 1607, going to 2021, what I found out was that the laws were crafted against blacks, Mexicans, Native Americans, and any person of color, including Asians as well. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because 20 years ago, Chief of Police Michael Moore no-knock raided my apartment twice in the same month. It was because of Illinois versus Gates. That's why he could do it. I hired Robert Shapiro and I beat those charges, but it cost me everything. It cost everything. Illinois Gates made it so that they could just investigate me with any information, even though it was false. That superseded Spinelli versus United States, which had a two-prong effect for police where they had to investigate both the information and the confidential informant. So that way one painter across the street couldn't say that painter's bad. That's what happened to me, and that's why I'm here. And what this lays out is the history of institutional racism in our country. I didn't start off building this wall to explain the history of institutional racism in America. That's just how it ended up. As I studied the laws starting in 1607, going to 2021, what I found out was that the laws were crafted against blacks, Mexicans, Native Americans, and any person of color, including Asians as well. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because 20 years ago, Chief of Police Michael Moore no-knock raided my apartment twice in the same month. It was because of Illinois versus Gates. That's why he could do it. I hired Robert Shapiro and I beat those charges, but it cost me everything. It cost everything. Illinois Gates made it so that they could just investigate me with any information, even though it was false. That superseded Spinelli versus United States, which had a two-prong effect for police where they had to investigate both the information and the confidential informant. So that way one painter across the street couldn't say that painter's bad. That's what happened to me, and that's why I'm here. And what this lays out is the history of institutional racism in our country. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a white actor named Dartmouth Rice who started the Jim Crow Act in 1830 and ended in 1860 when the Civil War began. However, white kids saw him get rich and famous, and so they copied the act. And where was the act done? In white neighborhoods that were all segregated. So white kids were on the street with their face painted black, putting black on their hands. And the Jim Crow Act is about slaves who are feeble-minded, they can't drink water, they miss their mouth. They said that slaves hadn't evolved all the way, they were still monkeys. This comes from Jim Crow. This comes from Jim Crow. So the Supreme Court justices, what are they affected by? Entertainment. Are you affected by movies and TV? Sure you are. So these guys saw the Jim Crow Act, and so a lot of them believed that blacks were feeble-minded and they hadn't yet evolved. They were still monkeys. I'm not kidding, this is real stuff. And so what do cops call people today? They call them clowns. That sad face of the clown is still available today. Let's talk. Jim Crow is branded when the amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th come out. And then in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the sentiment of most white people, not a few, the majority of white people, believed that blacks had not yet evolved and they were clowns. And so, of course, Homer Plessy can't ride in a white train car because he's a clown. He's got to go to the black train car. So they call them Jim Crow laws at Plessy versus Ferguson because they're going to separate the clowns from the whites. That's the reason why it's called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow meaning we're separating clowns from white people. And this sentiment takes over and keeps going and it's still, these Supreme Court justices are affected by the Jim Crow Act all the way until the 1960s and 70s. Jim Crow means 1,000 black babies dying in a hospital compared to every one white baby. That's what Jim Crow laws mean. Jim Crow is You're hearing a lot about voting rights in the media right now. Let me explain to you exactly how this happened. So your 15th Amendment passes that gives blacks the right to vote in America. Well, in 1876, they're taken away in Reese. And this says states can create barriers to voting. I've already told you this. And then Guiles versus Harrison, Giles versus Teasley is where Jackson Giles sued the Alabama State Registrar's Office, and Harris and Teasley were two registrars. He was funded by Booker T. Washington, who is historically known as an Uncle Tom, but he did fund Jackson Giles to do these lawsuits, and Jackson Giles lost. And this was upheld all the way until 1965. And then in 2014, I believe it was, in Shelby versus Holder, that's where Shelby County, Alabama, and Eric Holder, they sued Eric Holder so that they didn't have to have a federal decree to oversee their elections, and they just removed it. So that's why Alabama and all the southern states are putting in barriers to voting now. You're hearing a lot about voting rights in the media right now, let me explain to you exactly how this happened. So your 15th Amendment passes that gives blacks the right to vote in America. Well, in 1876, they're taken away in Reese, and this says states can create barriers to voting. I've already told you this. And then Guiles versus Harrison, Giles versus Teasley is where Jackson Giles sued the Alabama State Registrar's Office, and Harris and Teasley were two registrars. He was funded by Booker T. Washington, who is historically known as an Uncle Tom, but he did fund Jackson Giles to do these lawsuits, and Jackson Giles lost. And this was upheld all the way until 1965. And then in 2014, I believe it was, in Shelby versus Holder, that's where Shelby County, Alabama, and Eric Holder. To understand why things happen the way they do, you have to understand what's called conceptual analysis. Thank you, Jeffrey Kaplan. Conceptual analysis shows you what was really going on and why something happened the way it did. So Terry v. Ohio passes June 10th of 1968. But go back just 4 days before that, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And then between that, the Orangeburg massacre in Florida, or South Carolina, excuse me, and then in April of 68, you had MLK Jr. assassinated. So all these people being killed. Then after June 10th, 1968, when Terry's passed, gun legislation passes through Congress, which is in October of 1968. That makes it so cops can walk up and grab people. Who are they grabbing? Terry, June 10th of 1968, and then in October of 68, you got gun legislation that passes. So now cops can walk up to you and just grab you. In 71, Nixon declares war on drugs. John Erkelman in a Harper Bazaar magazine in the 90s would say that the reason Nixon declared war on drugs was so that he could take down hippies and blacks because he couldn't control either group. That's why he declared war on drugs. And then later on, in 1979, the FBI would establish the Plain View Doctrine. You'd never heard of that before a 1970, in Coolidge versus New Hampshire, in 1972. I don't know if that date's right, fact check me on that, please. In Coolidge versus New Hampshire, where then if they walked in and they could see it in plain sight, that's what the Supreme Court said, then it was legally binding. 79, the FBI Plain View Doctrine comes out from the Supreme Court. Corrigan versus Buckley created racial restrictive covenants where white people weren't legally allowed to sell their house to black people. Corrigan versus Buckley was overruled in 1948 in a case called Chille versus Kramer. In 1968, the Civil Rights Act passed, which had to do with ending redlining. Redlining had 4 colors. Green lining, which was all white. Blue lining was some black in there. Yellow lining was neighborhoods decreasing badly, lots of black people. Red lining was full of black people. I laugh because it's uncomfortable, but it's true. And now, after the 1968 Civil Rights Act, black people have no more problem in housing in America. When all the firearms rulings and restrictions are based on racism, that's what I have a problem with when my civil liberties are reduced because of racism. I mean, that's just a fact. If any of my civil liberties are reduced, in Senate versus United States, that's where they reduced my First Amendment right because someone was advocating peace and not to go to war, to buck the government and not go to war. And so yeah, now I want to create pamphlets and hand them out and say, assert your rights, don't go to war. So as far as gun legislation, all gun legislation is based on race. And so because of that, specifically because of that. This government has no right to take away our rights, our civil liberties. They're given to us by God. So we have to come together on that, on all of our civil liberties. Earl Warren freed blacks on May 17, 1954, in a case called Brown versus Board of Education. Now, you may think of Earl Warren as some great humanitarian. Not at all, not even close. He was a prison state, police state, Freemason who had won every election he'd ever gone out for. And what he did in 1944 in a case called Korematsu versus United States, in 1942, Earl Warren convinced FDR to lock up 100,000 Japanese because of World War II. When Korematsu sued, he lost because FDR had appointed 7 Supreme Court justices, and they said it wasn't racist at all. So, why did Earl Warren desegregate in 1954? Because he was an authoritarian and he had no idea what was going on in the black community. At restaurants, bars, clubs, they still had black establishments, and Earl Warren didn't know what was going on in the schools. What were they saying to the schools? Were they getting the same indoctrination that the white kids are? So Earl Warren desegregated because he's an authoritarian, and so that he could arrest blacks and create the penal system we have today. Some fascinating things happened as I built the wall and the history of institutional racism in our country. Take a look at the lynching chart. Here's the lynching chart over here. Now, I found more lynchings than the NAACP lists. However, the NAACP starts in 1882 and it ends in about 1965. Can you see the chart? You see it right here? Now, on the other side is the prison chart. The prison chart takes off, guess when? Terry v. Ohio, right there. That's when it takes off. And take a look at the shape of it. Look at the shape of the prison chart. Incredible. If I took a pin and magically could take a pin and stick it right there on the lynching chart, and I could make it swing around, I could do it in Photoshop. It would be the same shape as the prison chart. It would be the same shape. Do you see that? I didn't do that. Those are just statistics. When the lynchings end, the prison system begins. Some facts. We talked about the lynching chart and how it ends in about 1964, 1965. What happens? How come the lynchings in Alabama come to an end? It was because of a white conservative. This man right here is named Dr. T.C. Donald. He put his name in the Annister Star, along with 200 other white men and a handful of prominent black leaders in the community. And the lynchings came to an end. T.C. Donald said, I'm done with it. I'm gonna put up $20,000 to find out who the killer of Willie Brewster was. They found Darren Strange and they arrested him. Darren Strange was the first white man ever found guilty of killing a black man in America. The very first one. He never served any prison time. He was released on appeal and then shot in the face by his mechanic a few months later in another dispute. He was a real peach. Conservatives. Dr. T.C. Donald put his name in the paper and things changed. If you're going to talk about reparations, you have to be specific to the reasons why reparations are owed. Here's why. In 1926, in a case called Corrigan versus Buckley, the unelected tyrannical Supreme Court upheld racial restrictive covenants. What are the results of that? What that means is that you couldn't sell your house to a black person. As you know, generational wealth is typically handed down through the house in the family. Corrigan versus Buckley, white folks bought houses. Their grandparents passed it down to their kids, It happens again, it repeats about 1950 or so. The kids come back from college, they buy a house. Then they share with their kids. The money from the house transfers to the next generation. Then we get to the 60s and what happens? There's an explosion in America. Because blacks have been cut out of generational wealth, well, since the beginning, but for 4 decades since the Supreme Tyranny passed Corrigan versus Buckley. You have to be specific when you talk about reparations as to the reasons why, and it's Corrigan versus Buckley. The reason there's the term Black Lives Matter is because throughout the history of time, black people dying hasn't really mattered, and it doesn't matter today either. The only time change occurs where we change unjust and unconstitutional laws is when a white person dies or when a group of white conservatives step up to change things. And a simple example is Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jimmy Lee Jackson was a member of the NAACP, 25 years old, one of the most delightful people I've researched through this long research project I've been doing. And he was killed in broad daylight in a field by a state trooper named James Fowler. And Fowler admitted to killing him in broad daylight. Meanwhile, when James Reed went down for the second march, Selma Montgomery, front page news. He was on the front page of every single newspaper there was in America. Reeve's been killed. The Princeton-educated minister has been killed. Everybody outraged. The reason there's the term Black Lives Matter, silly me with the logic. How can we have a federal national holiday called Juneteenth when we have 2.5 million people who are still doing slave labor? The 13th Amendment was passed by Abraham Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that freed slaves. Lincoln made a deal with slave owners and said, it'll have 2 lines. It'll say, slavery's abolished unless you're convicted of a crime. $2 million people who are slaves in America. And then people out here are going to celebrate Juneteenth? Is that like having legal marijuana as people are rotting in cages for marijuana? Sorry, I hate to be logical here, but how can you celebrate Juneteenth when we have slaves in America? I gotta go, I can't stay on anymore. But listen, this is not critical race theory. This is the history of our country. These are the facts of our country. I didn't want the things that I found out to be true. Tennessee versus Garner is when a young black kid was shot in the back of the head while running away from the police. He was running away. They shot him in the back of the head, and the Supreme Court said that cops can't shoot you in the back of the head unless they're afraid for their lives. You think that's fair? You think that's okay? Is it a white kid that got shot in the back of the head? Reese versus United States strips away your voting rights. Lets the states create barriers to voting. Was that done for white people or against black people? It was done against black people. If you really want to know the history of our country, look up a guy named William Archibald Dunnan, D-U-N-N-I-N. That's the man who whitewashed history. William Archibald Dunnan. I'll see you guys tomorrow. You've heard of LASD death squads here in California? The billboards are all over LA. So I just put the documentary on YouTube, opened it up to public so you guys can watch it. And in the documentary, it says Terry plus Graham equals death. So what does that mean exactly? And how does that correlate with the LASD death squads here in LA? Cops are going on murdering people. So Terry gives police the right to investigate you if they're suspicious of you and walk up to you and grab you and put their hands on you. But if you walk up to me and grab me and put your hands on me, then Graham versus Connor says that objective reasonableness, police can use the amount of reasonable force that the reasonable officer on the scene determines. I swear to God, that's what it says. How can you be objective about a scene that you're the subject in? Okay, I can walk up to you, investigate you. I'm in fear for my life. That's literally from Graham versus Connor. That equals LASD death squad. I've heard of LA. Let's get super hyper specific when you talk about checks and balances. We know about the 3 police commissions, that police are completely lawless, that they're ineffective, that they desperately need real, actual oversight, checks and balances. It doesn't happen. It still has not happened. So when we get specific about checks and balances, let's talk about what those 2 new agencies would look like. This agency is the body cam agency. They get all the body cam from the police and they have on-site auditors. They live in these guys' ear and they see what they see through the body cam. There's a heart rate monitor attached that goes to every TV on this floor. So Alex Johnson has a TV on every floor here. His heart rate goes over 120, 100 beats a minute. The TV's on here and it flashes red. That means there's multiple people looking at Alex Johnson at one time. Checks and balances on top of checks and balances. That's Montesquieu's idea. That's not my idea. What is this other agency? They also, what they do is they oversee warrants and they can approve of police investigating people. We don't need police investigating people for jaywalking. We don't need it. Leave that person alone. We need to leave people alone. This agency would have a lot of power, subpoena power, and could pull police off of people if they were beating on them. On-site auditors, because thousands of police have planted drugs. You think it's just 1 or 2? We know about the serial ones, but there's lots. We need an on-site auditor, approve of warrants, film, record police, get all their body cam data, and create a transparency agency within this agency. The third agency, this man is named Harry Anslinger. He was a devout racist born in 1896, and he had one goal: to lock up as many black people as he could through marijuana. He criminalized marijuana because of his deep hatred and racism for black people. Well, after he criminalized marijuana in 1937, the marijuana study from LaGuardia, the governor of New York, released. And you know what it says? That marijuana has no character changes. It doesn't affect your personality. The LaGuardia report is full of things like aptitude tests, medical tests, aspiration tests. Do you lose aspiration? Double blind tests, psychological tests. The information's 80 years old, still really relevant. It doesn't affect your brain. If you're going through some sort of mental psychosis or having a hard time with life, it's because that's how it's happening. Take a hit of weed, it might actually calm you down. Don't buy the propaganda that Harry Anslinger created in the 30s. Read the LaGuardia report. I gotta go, I can't stay on anymore. But listen, this is not critical race theory. This is the history of our country. These are the facts of our country. I didn't want the things that I found out to be true. Tennessee versus Garner is when a young black kid was shot in the back of the head while running away from the police. He was running away. They shot him in the back of the head, and the Supreme Court said that cops can't shoot you in the back of the head unless they're afraid for their lives. You think that's fair? You think that's okay? Is it a white kid that got shot in the back of the head? Reese versus United States strips away your voting rights, lets the states create barriers to voting. Was that done for white people or against black people? It was done against black people. If you really want to know the history of our country, look up a guy named William Archibald Dunnan, D-U-N-N-I-N. That's the man who whitewashed history. William Archibald Dunnan. I'll see you guys tomorrow.